The Acolyte showrunner Leslye Headland knows how to play the Grievous game. In Unearthed podcast, she did it to perfection. Not only did she put herself as the victim, but she also used it to throw George Lucas under the bus and throw Star Wars under the bus, the franchise that just so happens to be where she's working now with the Acolyte. So she was discussing a recent Hollywood Reporter article that she wrote that somehow disputes the myth of the auteur, and it's unclear what exactly she writes in that article, but she goes on to kind of flesh it out here in this podcast, which is the IndieWire's Filmmaker Toolkit podcast. She says, I think it's also just my experience in the hiring world of being a female writer-director. The number of jobs that I have not gotten, infinite, and the amount of work that I have done to get them is enormous. Already playing the victim. She says she's lost infinite number of jobs just because she is a woman. That's absolute garbage. Don't buy it whatsoever. And then she's saying that she's put in a ton of work. It's enormous even for the jobs that she didn't get. And maybe that's true. That's possible. People put in a lot of work and they don't really see a lot of the fruits of that labor sometimes. That's just the way life works sometimes. But she's trying to say that she's a victim because that happened to her and she happens to be a woman. But then she goes on to say that she doesn't even know if any of it's true. She says, and listen, no one said to my face, we don't think you can do this because you are a girl. But I do think there is an idea of what a director looks like. So she basically says, I have zero evidence to do this, but, it's my opinion, so it must be true, right? Or there's something out there that lends me to think this. I don't know. Usually you would have some evidence to back up some opinion that you might have. She provides none. Anyways, she says, and a lot of people will say, no, it's what you do and the cream rises to the top and just the best person for the job. And the only reason why I disagree with that is partially because the auteur myth is so strong that it is really what they want to see is a guy come in there who will do everything himself, who basically can say, I will do all of this by myself and it'll be perfect and you don't need to worry about everything. She said, and it justifies some crazy behavior. It justifies, like, I remember somebody telling me something about a male showrunner, creator type person and their behavior. And listen, I'm not perfect by any means, but I think if you set yourself up that way, male or female, you are setting yourself up for failure. You're setting yourself up to fail because there's no way to do something like Russian Doll by yourself. There's no way to do something like any of the films that I mentioned in that Hollywood Reporter article. So again, I guess she's buying into this kind of narrative that somehow one single person makes movies and TV shows, and that's what a lot of people believe. I'm not really sure who those people are that believe this, but I'd like to know who they are because from everything I've seen, most people are crediting their cast, the crew, the actors. They credit all the work that goes into that production and everything that happens. But that doesn't mean that there isn't someone who has the vision that is coordinating all of that direction, which she seems to not understand. Anyways, she shifted the conversation to Star Wars. She says, one of the things that I just did recently is I bought all the concept art for Star Wars, for the original Star Wars by that great guy. She doesn't know who it is, but she eventually remembers it's Ralph McQuarrie. And she bought a 2-volume book from him. She goes on and says this guy created Star Wars. She's claiming that Ralph McQuarrie created Star Wars because she saw all the concept art that Ralph created. And she says, really, you see the evolution of the idea from what George is trying to express to him, to what he puts down on the piece of paper, to what it eventually becomes, to why he makes particular decisions, like why he decides to take things in one direction and not the other. She goes on and asserts, this is like what we understand to be Star Wars. The idea that that only came from George Lucas, that only George Lucas holds the key for what we understand to be Star Wars is just untrue. She's saying that the guy who came up with all this stuff, that was telling Ralph basically, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Can you put this? Can you paint this? She's saying that he doesn't hold the key to understanding what Star Wars is. Are you kidding me? Yes, he does. He created it. He created Star Wars. He had the vision. That's why it's there. And then she says, and I think the prequels are an excellent example of that. I disagree. I actually think his vision is still there. It's just poorly executed in the prequels. I think you can still see what his vision for Star Wars is, and he makes that very clear if you go back and look at a lot of the old interviews, even from the 80s, where he was telling you how the prequels would be laid out. And a lot of it is still there in those films. Nevertheless, she says, but you look at McQuarrie's work and you realize what an indelible mark this man has made on culture via this one role he played on this film. Clearly, yes. No one, I think, is trying to take away from Ralph McQuarrie's fantastic concept art that made it into the movies and is now iconic Star Wars. And the idea that, like, when you are hiring a director, that everyone is sitting in there waiting for George Lucas, and not for the person who's going to know, hire Ralph McQuarrie. That's George Lucas. George Lucas hired Ralph McQuarrie. That's what happened. Like, what are you even talking about? Stop it. That's the problem. That's the misogyny and the problem with the auteur myth as it stands today. The problem is that George Lucas hired Ralph McQuarrie and you didn't know it, and now you're blaming misogyny for it. Like, what are you even talking about? You are completely rambling, have no idea what you're saying. It's embarrassing. She goes on and says, because they are not thinking this is the person that will hire the right people, and this is the person that will be able to create the lookbooks and direct people to get them to that place. They're just thinking, do you have all the answers? And the truth is that nobody does, and anybody that says they do is lying. Like, what are you even talking about? George hired Ralph McQuarrie. He clearly knew he wasn't probably the best at painting, so he hired a great painter to express what he wanted so he could pitch the movie to Fox so they could make it. And guess what happened? It worked. Ralph's paintings convinced the people, along with George's pitch, to convince the people to make Star Wars, and we got Star Wars. This woman is insufferable.